Hello, everyone. I am Dr. Kaushik Chattopadhyay. I'm an associate professor in evidence-based healthcare at the University of Nottingham. And today I'm going to talk about clinical guideline to manage type 2 diabetes in adults by Ayurvedic practitioners. So this work has been funded by the UK's FCDO, NIHR, MRC, and Wellcome Trust. And it is basically a North-South partnership. You can see, like we have the researchers and investigators from the UK have collaborated with investigators in Nepal as well as in India. So we came up with this new idea of developing a clinical guideline to manage type 2 diabetes by Ayurvedic practitioners. This is about a little bit about the background. As you all know, maybe, like type 2 diabetes is a metabolic disorder. It's a common chronic condition which has major health and socioeconomic consequences. And in the Indian subcontinent, such as in India and Nepal, people commonly consult Ayurvedic practitioners for diabetes and use their medicines. So Ayurvedic practitioners are basically traditional medical, it's a traditional medical system. Ayurveda is a traditional medical system in India, as well as in Nepal and other South Asian countries. But the issue is, like there are strong concerns about the suboptimal diabetes management of many patients by these Ayurvedic practitioners, the way they treat patients, the pathway of care, the medicines they use. So there are strong concerns, like whether that's the best way or not for patients. So that, and the another major issue is there is no such good quality clinical guideline, diabetes clinical guideline for these Ayurvedic practitioners, which is based on the best available evidence. So that was a major issue actually. And this is about the levels of high evidence. As you can see at the very top of this pyramid is systematic reviews of randomized controlled trials. So basically what I'm trying to say over here is the evidence which comes from systematic reviews of randomized controlled trials are the best form of evidence. Here you can see in this slide, basically I have been invited to write book chapters and guest editorials. And the focus was basically, I was talking about the need for evidence-based local interventions, say, for example, Ayurveda, traditional Indian medicine. We also did a systematic review on content and quality of clinical practice guidelines for the management of type 2 diabetes in India. We couldn't find any such guideline in Nepal, but we did a systematic review for India because we found a few clinical practice guidelines for Ayurvedic practitioners in India. So you can see in this slide, like what we followed a systematic review, a comprehensive systematic review process. We searched a range of databases, and finally we found actually 3 clinical practice guidelines for Ayurvedic practitioners. But then there were major issues on, like in those guidelines. So our final recommendation was, like we couldn't recommend any of these guidelines because there were major issues. And our recommendation was to develop a good quality clinical guideline for these practitioners using standard tools. There are so many standard tools which are available how to develop a good quality clinical guideline. So in this slide, you can see, like in table 1, you can see we found 5 clinical guidelines in India, but out of these 5, 3 were focusing on Ayurveda. And none of these clinical guidelines were, had a focus, like they haven't considered the scientific evidence base in a rigorous way. And if you see table 3, you can see in this particular slide that we are talking about the overall quality of these clinical guidelines. And we have used the standardized AGRI tool to assess the quality of these clinical guidelines. And you can see, like finally, we couldn't recommend any of these clinical guidelines for real practice to, like to be used in real practice. So that was a major issue. So basically, based on this, we decided that, okay, we need to do something more and we need to develop a good quality clinical guideline for for these practitioners. Then what we did is like we did an effectiveness and we did another systematic review and meta-analysis on effectiveness and safety of Ayurvedic medicines in type 2 diabetes. So what we did, it was a very comprehensive systematic review, I will say, and we included RCTs, like which assessed any classical or proprietary Ayurvedic medicines, like containing plant or animal-based ingredients and in any form, and administered for at least 8 weeks. So, and we searched a range of sources, including 18 electronic databases. And finally, we included 219 articles in this particular systematic review, representing 199 randomized controlled trials of 98 Ayurvedic medicines. If I talk about the quality of these studies, overall, the quality of these studies were not that good. I won't say, were not good. The main issue was how they reported. So the reporting was poor. So I don't know whether the actual quality of these studies were good or not, but how they reported, it was poor. But at the same time, we found some good evidence that these Ayurvedic medicines, they do work, and a few studies. And if you ask me about the health-related quality of life, few studies also assess participants' health-related quality of life, which is an important outcome. And adverse events were not reported in many studies, but if adverse events were reported, then these were mostly none to mild and predominantly related to gastrointestinal intestinal tract. So basically, overall, in summary, what we what we said is there is some evidence that it works. These medicines are working, can work in type 2 diabetes, but there is a need to do some good quality studies in the future as well, and reported as well. So in this particular systematic review, basically we included, as I mentioned, 98 Ayurvedic medicines, and many were just plant-based, some were mineral-based, and a few were herbo-mineral combinations. We were able to conduct meta-analysis on 33 Ayurvedic medicines because there were 2 or more studies on that particular Ayurvedic medicine. But unfortunately, we couldn't do meta-analysis on 65 Ayurvedic medicines because there was just one single study available, so we couldn't do meta-analysis. And so basically, this is an example how we have presented our findings. This is for a particular herb. And you can see on this summary forest plot, we say that there are a number of outcomes. And if you see, favors intervention, favors this particular herb, and you can see in this, from this particular graph, from this particular figure, that, there is some evidence that it works in type 2 diabetes, say, for example. And then in this particular systematic review, we also used grade approach to assess the certainty of findings. So basically, the findings were initially ranked as high because we only included randomized controlled trials. So it starts at the top. And then we're downgraded to moderate, low, or very low if there was evidence of the following 5: risk of bias, inconsistency of results, indirectness of evidence, imprecision, and publication bias. So these were the 5 factors. I'm not going to talk a lot about these 5 factors, but these were taken into consideration. This is the grade approach that we have used. And then our this systematic review work has been covered widely in national and international media. You can see various newspapers, and they have published this systematic review, and they spoke about this systematic review. The same slide, it has been covered, the work has been covered in national and international media. So basically, based on the findings of that systematic review about effectiveness, we developed a clinical guideline to manage type 2 diabetes in adults by Ayurvedic practitioners. And in doing so, we, the whole work was guided by three documents or 3 frameworks. I will say that first is the UK's NICE guideline for developing clinical guidelines. The second one was we used grade approach. And the third one is the agree tool. So we consider all those three frameworks, or like these three documents guided our work. And then we followed a few steps to develop this clinical guideline. I will show you how. So first, as I have mentioned, we conducted a systematic review and effectiveness systematic review on Ayurvedic medicines to assess their effectiveness and safety in type 2 diabetes. And we assessed the certainty of the findings using the GRADE approach, as I have just mentioned. And then, based on the findings, we developed the evidence to decision framework. Um, we just focused on glycemic control and adverse events, and we used the same GRADE approach. So it was a standardized way how to develop a clinical guideline. And then the findings, whatever, like the evidence to decision framework was discussed among 17 among a guideline development group. It was an international group of 17 experts, including patients as well and patient representatives as well. So we met and made recommendations on Ayurvedic medicine's effectiveness and safety in type 2 diabetes based on the evidence to decision framework, based on their expertise and experience as well. So we came up with all these recommendations as a group. And we use the Delphi technique, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about later on. So based on that, we then drafted the clinical guideline based on the recommendations, like from the previous international guideline development group meeting. And at the same time, we actually we took a few things, we adapted a few things from the UK's NICE guideline. And the reason is basically, in Western medicine as well as in Ayurvedic medical system, the approach is the same. Basically, like in type 2 diabetes, we use, like there is a need to change lifestyle, as well as we need to use medicines to control type 2 diabetes. So because the basic principle is the same, so the lifestyle part was adapted from the Western guideline, and we merged it with our Ayurvedic medicines, like based on the evidence that we got. And then we shared the whole draft with our guideline development group for their feedback. They gave their feedback, experts gave their feedback about many things, say, for example, readability and understandability of the guideline. Patients gave their views and preferences, like what they prefer, what are their views. And finally, we finalized the guideline. So in short, what we have covered in the guideline is like many other like Western clinical evidence-based guidelines, is like we have mentioned about type 2 diabetes, what it is, definition, and other things. Then there is a section about how to diagnose and how to diagnose and how to manage type 2 diabetes. And then we have also covered how to detect and manage acute and chronic complications of type 2 diabetes, and when to refer to others, like specialists. And then we have also covered few other things similar to any other international good clinical guidelines, is like about advice on driving, advice on fasting during socio-cultural festivals. So as I have mentioned in my previous slide, that like in step number 2, we developed evidence to decision framework based on the GRADE approach. And similarly, so here in step number 2, we took this perspective, societal perspective was taken. And the following domains were considered when we were developing the evidence to decision framework. And these are the 8 standard questions which are there in, like in the GRADE tool, or GRADE. When we use GRADE approach, we consider these 8 questions. In step number 3, as I have mentioned, that, like we basically, like there was an international guideline development group, and with 17 members, and we used Delphi technique, Delphi consensus-based technique to develop the recommendations. And as I have mentioned, we considered the evidence presented in the evidence to decision framework, as well as their expertise and experience. And we had basically, like there were basically 3 types of recommendations we could make. And recommendations are basically, as you can see in figure 1, it's like a spectrum. So there were strong recommendations for or against the intervention. when where a high or moderate overall quality of evidence was reported, and the wording, what the wording we included is like, it's a standard process basically. So offer or do not offer depending on the direction, whether it's for the intervention or against the intervention. Similarly, when there was low or very low overall quality of evidence, we said that it's a it is a type of weak recommendation. And the wording included, we can consider offering or do not consider offering. So these are the standard way of making recommendations in a clinical guideline, and we have followed that. And then if we couldn't make any recommendation, or so in that case we said no recommendation, or recommendation to be used in research only. So this is how we have developed the clinical guideline. Now basically what we are doing is like, because it was a new approach where we have merged the lifestyle part from Western guidelines with Ayurvedic medicines from based on evidence, based on good quality, based on the best available evidence, I will say. So we have merged these two things, and we came up with a new idea to develop a clinical guideline for Ayurvedic practitioners. So that's the reason we are doing we are planning to do an evaluation. And the main research question at that point will be whether the introduction of such a clinical guideline can improve the management of type 2 diabetes by Ayurvedic practitioners or not, compared to usual practice, whatever they do without a clinical guideline. And in doing so, before doing that major clinical trial, we would like to, we are doing the feasibility trial right now in Nepal. So this is a 2-arm feasibility cluster randomized controlled trial with blinded outcome assessment, and we are also doing qualitative evaluation. So in this feasibility study, basically we have around 12 public and private Ayurveda centers inside the Kathmandu Valley or outside the Kathmandu Valley in Nepal. And then eligible participants are basically new type 2 diabetes adult patients, that is treatment naive, and the glycated hemoglobin HbA1c level, we call it, should be between 6.5% to, but should be less than 9%. And we are currently recruiting our participants, and the target is 120, 60 per group. So we have started this feasibility study. We will be collecting quantitative data and qualitative data to see whether in the future the definitive cluster randomized control trial can be conducted or not. And that's the progress we have made. And that's all. Thank you very much.